All right, so let's dive right in, shall we?
Let's do it.
We're taking a deep dive today into a scene that's really captured everyone's attention, and it involves President Trump fresh off that election win.
Yeah, pretty surprising setting for a victory lap, wouldn't you say?
Right. Not exactly the traditional inauguration ball. We're talking cage side at UFC 309, November 16th, 2024, Madison Square Garden. The energy in that place must have been off the charts.
Oh, I bet. We've seen Trump at UFC events before, of course, but this one felt different. This had that victory lap vibe, like he was sending a message.
A message that's got everyone buzzing, that's for sure. And honestly, it's not just the setting itself, it's a company he kept that night.
Right, that entourage. It was a who's who of Trump's world.
Yeah, it wasn't just a bunch of suits and politicians. We're talking Dana White, Elon Musk, Kid Rock, even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. It's a mix that makes you go, okay, what's going on here?
Definitely not your typical post-election gathering. So the question is, what does this group tell us about Trump 2.0, about his priorities as he heads into this second term?
Yeah, what kind of message was he sending with this whole spectacle? So let's break it down, starting with the crowd's reaction. Reports are saying that when Trump arrived, the place erupted. Deafening cheers, chants of USA echoing through the garden. Clearly, the guy's got a connection with those UFC fans.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, it's interesting. Even fighter Michael Chandler, who was actually on the fight card that night, he predicted this whole thing. He was saying how he thought Trump would be celebrating a victory at UFC 309. Imagine the pressure, fighting with the president watching you.
Talk about a high-stakes fight night. But, it really highlights how Trump leverages these kinds of events to connect with his base. It reinforces that image of him being a man of the people, enjoying the same things they do.
It goes deeper than just shared interests, though, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It's about creating the sense of belonging, of being part of a movement.
Right. And speaking of that movement, let's talk about that entourage, because that's where things get really fascinating.
Yeah, we've got Dana White, the UFC president. He's a longtime friend of Trump's, a very vocal supporter.
Right. He even spoke at one of those massive Trump rallies leading up to the election. So seeing him there at UFC 309 wasn't a huge surprise.
Right, but it does make you wonder, what's the significance of having him front and center at this kind of event?
Well, on one level, it's a clear signal of how much Trump values loyalty. These are the people who stuck by him through thick and thin, and now they're reaping the rewards. But think about what that means in terms of governing.
Are we talking loyalty over competence?
Exactly. Does it create a closed-off system where dissenting voices are shut out? Does it hinder his ability to make the best decisions for the country as a whole?
It definitely raises some questions about how much this inner circle will influence actual policy decisions.
Absolutely. And then you've got Elon Musk right there in the mix. He's now heading up this brand new Department of Government Efficiency, which is interesting itself.
Oh yeah, that one raised some eyebrows.
And he's even using Twitter to ask for public input on who should be the next Treasury Secretary. It's a very unconventional move, bringing a tech giant like Musk into the fold.
Especially for someone who campaigned on that drain the swamp anti-establishment message. So what's the play here? Is it genuine transparency, or is it just a savvy PR move?
Yeah.
Make people feel like they're part of the process.
It could be a bit of both. But you have to remember, Musk is a powerful figure in his own right, with his own agenda and his own political leanings.
Right, so that brings up a whole other set of questions.
Like, how much influence will these tech billionaires have on government policy? Are we comfortable with that?
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. And then to top it off, you've got RFK Jr. just casually hanging out with the president.
Talk about a plot twist. From political adversary to now the head of HHS, it's been a wild ride.
It really has. They started out on opposite sides of the spectrum, but Kennedy ended up endorsing Trump, becoming a key advisor. It's pretty remarkable.
It really highlights Trump's knack for bringing in these unconventional figures, these people who don't fit neatly into those traditional political boxes.
Yeah, it definitely challenges that whole left-right divide.
Which can be seen as refreshing.
Right.
But it also makes you wonder, what happens when ideology takes a backseat to personal loyalty? Is that how we want our government to function?
Right. Does it create a more pragmatic approach to governing, or does it undermine any sense of consistent ideology? So many questions.
So many questions, and that's just scratching the surface. We haven't even touched on Kid Rock and Tulsi Gabbard, who are also part of that UFC crew.
Yeah.
Each person in this group represents a different facet of Trump's support base.
It's a fascinating mix, for sure. But before we get too lost in the who's who of it all, we need to talk about the elephant, or maybe the podcasting giant, in the room. Joe Rogan.
Ah, yes, the Joe Rogan connection. We can't ignore that.
We can't. Weeks before the election, Trump did that marathon interview on Rogan's podcast, over 3 hours long. It practically broke the internet. And what happened? Rogan endorsed him.
That interview was a game changer, no doubt. It highlights the growing influence of these alternative media platforms, these spaces where people get their news and form their opinions. Love him or hate him, Joe Rogan has a massive audience, and his endorsement definitely had an impact.
Oh, huge impact. And it's not just about reaching more people. It's about controlling the narrative, bypassing those traditional media filters and speaking directly to voters.
You got it. And Rogan, well, he didn't exactly shy away from sharing his opinions after the election either. He even went so far as to speculate that Biden might have secretly voted for Trump.
Based on what their surprisingly friendly Oval Office meeting.
Exactly, which, is pure speculation. But it just adds to the whole bizarre, unpredictable nature of the Trump era. You never know what's going to happen next.
It's true. Okay, so this UFC appearance, it wasn't Trump's first time dipping his toes into the world of entertainment during the campaign.
Oh no, not by a long shot.
Weeks earlier, he held that massive rally right there in Madison Square Garden. Remember that one?
Oh, how could we forget?
Dana White was a speaker there too, emphasizing the need for change, praising Trump's leadership. But of course, it wouldn't be a Trump event without a little bit of controversy.
You're telling me. There was that whole incident with the comedian who made those off-color remarks about Puerto Rico.
Right, it was a whole thing. And it just goes to show Trump thrives on that kind of us against the world energy.
Exactly. It creates this sense of solidarity among his supporters. It paints him as a fighter, as someone who's not afraid to take on the establishment, to challenge the norms.
Okay, so we've got this UFC appearance, the rally at MSG, the Joe Rogan endorsement. It paints a pretty clear picture of Trump's approach to politics, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. He understands the power of spectacle, of blurring the lines between entertainment and politics, and he's not afraid to use it to his advantage.
And it's effective, but it also raises some concerns, right?
Right, like, can substance and nuance even survive in a world that's so dominated by sound bites and spectacle?
And speaking of questions, let's not forget about those cabinet appointments that were happening around the same time. Chris Wright, the CEO from the oil and gas industry, he was named Energy Secretary.
Yeah, that was a big one. Definitely aligns with Trump's energy dominance agenda.
Absolutely. But it also raises concerns about the environment, about climate change.
Exactly, and it definitely puts him at odds with the global push for clean energy. So, we'll see how that plays out.
And then there's still the Treasury Secretary position, which is up in the air. And you know who weighed in on that one? Elon Musk.
No way, really.
He publicly endorsed Howard Lutnick, that financial services CEO known for his, well, some might say risky approach to finance.
Interesting choice.
Yeah.
Lutnick's a bit of a Wall Street maverick, not exactly known for playing it safe.
Exactly. So let's just rewind for a second, take it all in. We've got Trump at this UFC fight, surrounded by this eclectic mix of loyalists, celebrities, and unconventional figures.
All while making these key cabinet appointments that could have massive policy implications.
Right, and setting the stage for his second term. It's a lot to process.
It really is. It's like he's weaving together these seemingly disparate threads to create this very specific narrative, this image of strength and defiance, this break from the norm.
And it's working, at least for his base. They're energized, they feel seen, and they're ready for round two. But the question is, what about everyone else?
That's the big unknown, isn't it? How will this blend of entertainment and politics, this reliance on loyalty over traditional experience, how will it actually play out in the long run?
Only time will tell, I guess.
Time will tell. But one thing's for sure, it's going to be a fascinating ride and probably a pretty bumpy one.
Buckle up, everybody. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still so much more to unpack, and that's what we're going to do next. We're going to dig deeper into some of these details, explore the nuances, and try to make sense of it all.
We're just getting started.
So we've laid out the scene, this whole spectacle at UFC 309, but there's another layer here that we haven't really touched on. It's not just about the event itself, it's about the timing.
Right. The context is key here.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating. This wasn't just any random UFC event. This was just days after that very public Oval Office meeting with Biden.
Oh, yeah. That very formal, traditional handover of power. The photo op, the whole 9 yards.
Right. And then bam, he's at a UFC fight, surrounded by this totally different crew. It's almost like he's sending a very deliberate message.
Like, I'll play the game, but I'm still calling the shots.
Exactly. And it really reinforces that image of him as a showman, as someone who understands how to use these moments, these spectacles, to his advantage.
Oh, absolutely. He's a master of that. And remember, this is a man who built his entire career on branding and image. He knows how to grab headlines, how to control the narrative.
And this UFC appearance, it was more than just a publicity stunt. It was about sending a signal not just to his supporters, but to everyone.
To his opponents, the media, world leaders, you name it.
So let's try to decode that signal. What do you think he was trying to convey with this whole thing?
Well, on the surface, it's a show of force, a way of saying, hey, I'm still relevant, I'm still powerful.
But it goes deeper than that, right?
Yeah, right. It taps into that whole us versus them mentality that's become such a core part of his brand.
It's like he's still the outsider, even though he's literally just won another term as president.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's constantly positioning himself as the underdog, as the one fighting against the establishment. And events like this UFC appearance, they played perfectly into that narrative.
It's a strategy that's worked incredibly well for him, especially in today's media landscape. Attention spans are short. People are drawn to spectacle.
It's all about grabbing attention, creating those viral moments. And Trump, he's a master of that game. He's figured out how to bypass traditional media and connect directly with his base.
But the question is that sustainable in the long run?
Right. Can you really govern by spectacle? At some point, you have to deliver on the promises, right?
You have to address the real challenges facing the country.
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think anyone has a clear answer, but it's definitely something worth thinking about as we head into this second term.
Okay, so we've talked about the timing, the symbolism, the messaging behind this UFC appearance, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about the policy implications of some of the decisions that were being made around this time.
Right. The actual nuts and bolts of governing. Let's get into it.
So we've already mentioned Chris Wright, the new energy secretary.
That big oil CEO.
The one and only. And his appointment, well, it's pretty clear signal that Trump is doubling down on fossil fuels.
No doubt about it.
Yeah.
Wright's background, his whole career, it's all about that energy dominance agenda, which basically means prioritizing domestic energy production, even if it means putting the environment at risk.
Right. And this is happening at a time when the rest of the world is pushing for clean energy and climate action.
Exactly. It's a pretty stark contrast. And it raises a lot of questions about what this means for the future of our planet, for our relationships with other countries, for the whole global effort to combat climate change.
Big questions, for sure. And we're also still waiting for a definitive answer on who's going to be the next Treasury Secretary.
Oh, right. That whole saga with Elon Musk and
Howard Lutnick.
Howard Lutnick, yeah. That guy's a real wild card, known for shaking things up on Wall Street.
Not exactly a traditional pick for a cabinet position.
Definitely not. So that suggests that maybe, just maybe, Trump is considering a more unorthodox approach to economic policy in his second term.
It's definitely a possibility. Okay, so let's pause here for a moment and take stock of what we've got. We've got Trump at this UFC fight sending this message of strength and defiance. We've got these key cabinet appointments that suggest a continuation of some of his most controversial policies.
And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a country that's still deeply divided, a world that's facing some major challenges. That's a lot to process.
It really is. And it's hard to predict what's going to happen next. But I think what we can do is try to understand the forces at play, the motivations, the potential consequences.
That's what we're trying to do here, right? Provide some context, some insights, so people can make sense of it all.
Exactly. We're not here to tell anyone what to think. We're just here to encourage critical thinking, to spark some conversation. So before we move on, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about governing by spectacle. Do you think Trump can keep this up for another 4 years?
Well, it's definitely an effective strategy in the short term, but in the long run, it's hard to say. I mean, one potential pitfall is that it's really hard to maintain that level of excitement and spectacle over an extended period of time.
Yeah, at some point people get tired of the show. They want to see results.
Right. Another potential pitfall is that this approach can be very alienating to certain segments of the population. Not everyone is drawn to that kind of drama and chaos.
Some people crave stability, predictability, a more traditional approach to governing.
Absolutely. And there's also the risk of overexposure, right? If everything is treated like a major spectacle, it starts to lose its impact.
It all becomes background noise.
Exactly. So it's a delicate balance. And the question is, can Trump, who seems to thrive on this kind of chaos and disruption. Can he find that balance? Can he tone it down when he needs to, or will he just keep pushing the boundaries?
It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in the next 4 years. But I think we need to shift our focus